The commander of the Cuban troops in Angola reviewed the situation the next day with his battle-weary troops. The strain of war can be seen in their steps and in their faces. Still believing they had superior equipment, the South Africans continued to attack into March. They did have excellent artillery, and that was causing the Cubans and the Angolans some problems. The South Africans thought that their tanks were superior to those of the Cubans, but this turned out not to be the case. As the lines held at Cuito Cuanavale, the Cubans, Angolans, and SWAPO troops pushed to the south, toward the Namibian border, and into that country.
At the same time, they also attacked South Africa on two other fronts. You know, Cuito Cuanavale is more in the eastern part. In the western part, they also attacked. And the army consisted of FAPLA, which is a very good army now, of the Cuban troops, of SWAPO, the Liberation Organization in Namibia, and the ANC, the Liberation Organization in South Africa. So actually what you had was a liberation army of a number of countries, a number of liberation movements in countries coming together to defeat apartheid in South Africa.
The leader of SWAPO, the Namibian resistance, had this to say in a speech.
SWAPO and its military wing, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia plan, has created confidence in the masses of the Namibian people that they are self-liberators. So the struggle will be intensified until all the forces of fascism, colonialism, as represented in our country by the Botha regime, are wiped out and the seizure of power becomes a reality in Namibia.
They push it all the way back to the Namibian border, and again South Africa wanted to negotiate. But this time it was more of a major defeat than last time. And the reason is that Cuba brought over, and Angola had something called MiG-23s. These are these jets that South Africa, that the Soviet Union, you know, gave to Cuba. Well, actually Cuba bought them, and also Angola bought some. They were the MiGs, the Mirage jets that South Africa bought from France were no match for these. South Africa also has these really big tanks that they call elephants. These elephant tanks scare people because they're really big and they're really loud, but they are no match for the smaller, more accurate Soviet tanks. So they were picking off tanks like that. If you got into a South African tank, that was like a death wish, just like a Mirage jet. It was a death wish because there was no way that you could live. So they were knocking out all of South Africa's major weapon systems. What happened in this battle was that South Africa also attacked with what's called the Namibian Territorial Militia. These are black troops that South Africa was using as cannon fodder. These troops rebelled and refused to fight because they realized what the deal was. So South Africa had to move up its white troops. And so what South Africa began to have to deal with is a lot of white troops were getting killed. Their planes were getting knocked out of the sky. They couldn't even send up a plane. Their troops were getting beat really bad. So the white South Africans were getting killed by the dozens or scores or whatever. And the interesting thing was that all of a sudden within South Africa a resistance movement began to develop for the draft. People began to say, I am not going into the army.
Sounds like the United States in Vietnam, where particularly black and Hispanic soldiers got fed up, you know, fighting and dying over in Vietnam. American jets were getting shot off by Vietnamese rifles, etc. And so the war just couldn't continue.
Right.
And so it's the same thing going on in South Africa. Right.
So on the one hand you have, which is a very important point I'd like to make, you have South Africa in Namibia attacking Angola, and South Africa has made Namibia the most militarized area along the border, the most militarized area in the world. There are more weapons, more guns, more tanks, more missiles in the world, right, in that northern part of Namibia. So of course they felt like they were going to just again take this town and it would be very easy. But the important thing for your viewers to understand is that the balance of forces in Southern Africa have totally changed now. South Africa cannot go around with impunity and not expect to get beat.
In May of 1988, Fidel Castro addressed the special meeting of the non-aligned countries on the importance of Cuito Cuanavale.
But I may assure you something.
La historia de África va a tener un momento muy importante.
The history of Africa will have a very important moment.
Antes de Cuito Cuanavale.
But when it is written, it will be written
y otra después de Cuito
before Cuito Cuanavale and
porque
after
la poderosa
Cuito Cuanavale.
Sudáfrica,
because the powerful South Africa,
los blancos, la
the
raza
white,
superior,
the superior race,
se estrellaron
clashed
contra un pedazo de territorio
against a small piece of territory
defendido por negros y
defended
mestizos.
by white and mulattoes.
Llamó mulato a todos los cubanos.
We call all the Cubans mulattoes.
Desde
white
Angola
and mulattoes
y del Caribe.
from Angola and the
Imagínate
Caribbean.
la gran
So
potencia
you can
poderosa
imagine
que
the
estos
big
10 años
power which
armando,
has been building up for 10
invencible,
years,
inteligente,
invincible, the intelligent power
y que se haya estrellado
which clashed
contra un pedazo de territorio
against
aquí,
a small piece of land. When you meet a white South African,
con un racista,
a racist,
lo único que tienen que
the only
preguntarle
thing you have to ask
es
him
¿qué
is
pasó en Cuito
what
Cuanavale?
happened in Cuito Cuanavale?
¿Qué pasó en
What
Cuito
happened in
Cuanavale?
Cuito
Esa es
Cuanavale?
la cosa que hay que preguntarle.
And there's a serious hope that there will be a negotiated settlement to the problems of Southern Africa, and that South Africa will at least be put in its place for the time being. And we'll just have to see if this is a ruse or if they're forced into scaling back on their operations.
Every time there's been a peace agreement or peace discussions with South Africa has used that discussion to move more troops and to rearm. And so what's happening now is South Africa is trying to find a way to rearm itself and get more modern weapons so they can go back into Angola. Everybody knows that. Everybody. And so what they're trying to do is use this Cuban troops issue as a guise to do that. And the Angolans and the Cubans know what's happening because they fought South Africa before. But because of this major defeat, it causes a very big problem for South Africa, because they're going to have to either negotiate or fight. And they can't win by fighting, so they're going to have to negotiate.
Does South Africa want to negotiate?
¿Por qué Sudáfrica
Why
quiere
is it that
negociar?
South Africa wants to negotiate?
Sudáfrica quiere
Well, South
negociar
Africa wants to
porque
negotiate
se ha encontrado frente a una fuerza
because
muy
it is
poderosa,
fighting a very
como
strong force,
nunca se había
as he had
encontrado.
never clashed before, as he had never
En ninguna
encountered
parte.
before. Nowhere
Es decir, este no es
had
el
it
año
found such a force
75.
before. This is not the year
En el año
1975.
75 reunimos
In the
400
year
tanques,
1975,
cañones,
we had 400
pero
tanks,
no teníamos
cannons,
aviación.
but we did not have the aviation.
No teníamos
We did
prácticamente
not
medios antiaéreos.
have anti-aircraft practically
Ahora se han acumulado
hardly
tantos
any.
tanques por aquí,
Now we have accumulated so many
más o
tanks
menos
around here.
como todos los tanques que tiene Sudáfrica.
We have accumulated around here as many
¿Verdad?
tanks more or less as South Africa has,
Son mejores.
but they are better.
Bueno,
We are not
victoria militar.
working to
No
obtain
queremos una
a
sola
military victory.
victoria.
We don't want to have a military
Basta con
victory.
que cueste una sola vida
It's enough if you
y no
have
haríamos nada
to
por
lose one
glorias y
life
victorias militares.
and any military glory really fades in
Es
the
decir, nosotros
face
tenemos la
of
responsabilidad de cada
losing
uno de los
lives,
hombres que están ahí.
because we feel responsible for the life of each and every of those men there.
Luchamos
We are striving
por una solución justa
for a fair solution
digna,
to the problem,
que garantice la
a
seguridad de
dignified
Angola,
solution
la
to the problem which
independencia de
would
Namibia.
guarantee the
Y a
security of
cambio de eso,
Angola and the
gustosamente,
independence of Namibia.
en el
And in
periodo de tiempo
exchange
que
for
se
that,
acuerde,
with
retiraremos
pressure,
hasta
in
el
the
último
period of
soldado.
time agreed, we will
Y nuestra
withdraw
posición,
our troops.
hemos creado todas
Then
las condiciones
we
para
have
que haya una
created
solución.
the conditions so that a
Claro,
settlement can
eso
be reached.
implica riesgos.
Of course, that entails
Hemos
risks,
estado dispuestos a correr
and
los
we
riesgos.
have been willing to
Y
run
se va a producir
such
una
risks.
confrontación seria,
And
grande.
a serious confrontation
Hemos
might
tenido
occur.
que correr el riesgo porque de otra
But
forma
we
no
have to
habría
run
solución.
such a risk, otherwise there wouldn't be a settlement.
From Fidel Castro's opinions from May of 1988 and Kenneth Jones of December of 88, we turn to John Stockwell in February of 1989. John's book In Search of Enemies is primarily about Angola. South Africa is so-called getting out of Angola, but they did before, and then they came right back in again when there was, it looked like there was going to be peace in the area. Now, looks like the same thing happened. They're getting the Cubans to pull out. They got their ears pinned back. They pulled away. But now I understand that I heard where they've actually made some more armed attacks already in Angola.
Three weeks ago in London, in the interviews and discussions, this is very much what we were talking about, was what is the guarantee that South Africa is going to respect this? The Cubans pull out, South Africa pulls out. What's going to keep South Africa is violating every international law and boundary in southern Africa. What's going to keep them from going back into Angola? How long will it be before they put their troops back in? And the answer was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And now, interestingly enough, Washington's reaction on this, of course, Reagan had a big aid program to Savimbi, and Bush has promised to continue it, and obviously is clearly doing so. Now, Savimbi's pinned down on the border down there now, militarily, and is a little better off than the Contras are, and he was taking a beating, so the South African forces came in to bail him out. The U.S. Response, they obviously didn't stand up and say, well, we happen to be in there in force with the CIA and we call the South Africans in. Their statement was, I can just remember, back in the task force scribbling away the wording on the statement, to put...
When you were running the Angola operation.
When we were running, their answer was that it has not been confirmed by any reliable sources that the South Africans are in fact back in Angola.
We should in fact tell our audience that John Stockwell was the CIA officer in charge of the Angola operation and resigned after that, wrote his book In Search of Enemies that began his process of developing a criticism of the CIA, and has been speaking out as a peace activist ever since. So Angola has basically been a hot point for the whole Reagan administration.
Well, let's strip Angola down just real briefly while we're on the subject. Chester Crocker, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, was talking to some of us in the Africanist progressive side of things, Jerry Bender particularly at the International School at USC, and promising that he was going to negotiate a settlement for Namibia and get the Cubans out of Angola. And Jerry, a friend whom I respect enormously, said that, if you succeed, we'll give you credit for it publicly. And Crocker succeeded. He pounded away and negotiated away, and it took 6 years, and eventually he worked out a deal where the South Africans would give Namibia its independence and the Cubans would go home. And the Cubans are going home, and it's a real deal. And the South Africans are, there is at least some kind of a farcical independence being given to Namibia. The oversight, is it going to work? Are the UN forces going to cover it? Are death squads going to be left behind to keep a proxy control? That question remains. But still, Bender and I, supporting him, were obliged to say, yes, Crocker, you did it. Namibia finally is getting its independence. However, in that fascinating, complex deal, the Cubans are coming home, South Africa is giving independence to Namibia, and getting out of Angola and promising to stay out even though. But the United States, although arbitrating that thing, did not promise to cease its aid to Savimbi to destabilize Angola. Now that is brass.
But it's also just idiotic. I mean, it sort of confirms your thesis in Search of Enemies, that the role of the CIA is to search out enemies, to fight wars, to destabilize the world. Here's a region that needs stability. There's negotiations to try to stabilize it, and the U.S. keeps supporting these rebel forces to try to overthrow the Angola government that led to the absolutely bizarre situation of the Cubans there that were supporting the Soviet-backed Angolan government, protecting the U.S. multinational corporations. I think Gulf Oil had big...
Gulf Oil, which was bought up by Chevron.
The Cubans were